This is Mark Lieberman, the host of The World According to Mark, broadcast through WPVM FM in Asheville, North Carolina. And we have an interesting guest today. I'm going to see if I can do this campy little promo. Take me out to the ball. All right, that's enough of that, right? Now, at least you understand why I'm wearing this. Can you turn this part off? Okay, time out. And as it fades off into the background, I want to introduce my interesting, multi-talented guest, Ted Meyer, but we can't get that song off. Ted Meyer, as it so happens, is a baseball enthusiast, aficionado, expert kind of guy. When he's not being an expert kind of guy, working as a partner in the national law firm of Blank Rome, and that's my wife handling the recording back there. Blank Rome. A little bit more about Ted. I'll let him talk a little bit more, but his specialty is labor and employment laws, primarily, I guess, on the management side, trying to help companies comply with applicable laws and hopefully run better. And somehow, through the COVID, and Ted will discuss it more, he found a relationship between baseball and how industries should run. So let me not go on as thank you, Ted, for being on the show today.
Great to be here. Thanks, Mark.
And there's no explanation for what I'm wearing, but you can explain what it is that you're wearing for those who are watching this on Facebook.
I am wearing a replica jersey of the Homestead Grays, and the Homestead Grays were one of the greatest dynasties in the Negro Leagues. It's a team that not many people know about, but it's a team for whom many, many stars, all-time greats played. The historian Bill James did a list of the top 100 players of all time, and he included players from the Negro Leagues. And it turned out that 9 of those 100 players played for the Homestead Grays in the 1930s. And some think the early version, the 1931 version of the Homestead Grays may have been the best team in baseball history. Unfortunately, they don't get the credit that they are due. So I try and do my part by wearing their jersey.
Okay, caught most of what you said. There was a little glitch there, but let's go on. So Ted, why don't you tell the story of how you decided to write this forthcoming book? I mean, you finished writing it, but it's not due to come out, I guess, until January of next year. Tell us what it's called and why you did it.
Yeah, the title of the book is Championing the Cause of Leadership, a look at the baseball dynasties. And essentially what it is it's a study of the baseball dynasties in both the major and the Negro Leagues, which are now combined really into the major leagues. And the takeaways for modern teams and groups, the things that we can learn from those dynasties. And as it turns out, we can learn a great deal in terms of leadership, organizational success, and even personal success from these great teams. When I was in law school, they taught us that we needed a hobby in our very stressful occupation, and I chose studying baseball. And so over my 30 plus years as a lawyer, I've also become a baseball historian. Over the years, I focused primarily on the dynasties, and I found them very interesting for a number of reasons, including I wanted to know why they succeeded. What was the difference between the dynasties and the almost dynasties, or the teams that weren't doing as well? And I learned that there was sort of an intersection between my hobby and my profession, and that the advice I gave was in some way related to my experiences learning about the baseball dynasty. So I found that there was a great deal of overlap between baseball and industry.
So good for all of us that you didn't choose the hobby of collecting stamps or playing the flute. But I want to give you a chance again to expand upon my first comment, which was that you not only presumably were a baseball fan going back years, as many of us older, including old people, are remembering the halcyon days of baseball, and having watched Gary Cooper play Lou Gehrig in his movie 13 times. And I just watched The Natural, which is totally phantasmagorical, meaning almost pure fantasy, for the 16th time. But you must have saw something in your practice and in your representation of these companies that was somewhat dysfunctional or could have been done better or whatever, as you were giving legal advice. And can you key in on what that was or what that is?
I represent some of the world's top companies, and they are in very competitive environments, and doing things marginally different in various areas can make a huge difference. And that's very similar to what the baseball dynasties learned, is that they had to do the little things right. They had to discover things that other teams didn't discover. They had to innovate. They had to motivate. They had to inspire their top leaders. They had to treat their employees the right way, and so on and so on and so on. And there are just so many parallels there to business.
Okay, so a little bit of a lead in also about baseball. As I said, I've always been fascinated by baseball, the mental gyrations of the manager and strategy. I lived in Houston for a while when which is where you are at currently with Blank Rome. And I was there during the time in which the Astros were playing in the gigantic Astrodome, and they didn't hit home runs there very often because they weren't a power hitting team, and the Astrodome was so large. But one of the things I really, really enjoyed about the Astros during that era, which is in the late 70s, was their base running skill and how they incorporated base running into being a fundamental part of their playing. But it's a true fact that while baseball is probably, I don't know, the oldest organized professional sport perhaps in the US, and you'll check me if I'm wrong on that football and basketball both, I think, have eclipsed baseball in terms of the number of people that watch it. Obviously, the stadiums tend to be larger, much more revenue, and so on and so forth. And yet, baseball still retains this hold on our psyche, I think. But let you talk about that more than me.
Well, baseball has been in this country, as you said, for a very long time. And the first organized professional league was in the 1870s. The National League was formed in 1876. And at that time, there were baseball teams and leagues everywhere. Towns played baseball, schools played baseball. There were all kinds of baseball teams in industry, churches, synagogues, prisons, everywhere. This was at a time, obviously, where there was not television and there was not radio. And so people would go play baseball. They would go watch the teams, and many people played. And so all of us have baseball in our background somewhere. And from this emerged this phraseology, which I find very interesting, that we use just as a matter of course in business and just in life. If you do a great job on a client pitch, you've hit it out of the park. If someone's in trouble, they have 2 strikes against them. If somebody comes up with a bad idea, it's out of left field. And we use this phraseology as a matter of course in our lives. And when we use it with each other, really what we're doing is we're connecting on a deeper level. And it says, hey, there's something about us that is the same. And that is in fact true, because just about everybody you meet has baseball in their background, either current generation or some generation before. And so it's a great way of connecting. It's a great way of getting to know one another. Using this phraseology, and again, it says, "Hey, we're a lot alike to begin with."
Okay, well, why don't we? We'll get back to business again, but why don't we talk baseball, pure baseball, for a moment? Your book again deals with a lot of things, but it deals with the general concept of dynasties, baseball dynasties, what makes a dynasty, how a dynasty is sustained, what are the ingredients. So maybe we should start out definitionally. Tell us what you considered for your book and in general to be a dynasty type team.
Yeah, this is very important. It's a very important question. And the answer is very important because there is no definitive definition of a dynasty in baseball. And historians disagree on which teams were dynasties. And there's reasonable minds can differ on which teams are dynasties. I had page limits in my book, and I had to come up with a definition that I used consistently. So my definition is as follows. A team had to win in successive years. So they had to win at least one back-to-back. They had to be a great team for at least 4 years. And they had to be generally recognized by historians of the time as the best team of their era. And so that is a pretty tough definition and tends to leave out some teams that were very good. But again, I had to limit the teams I studied. So that's how I did it.
So it leaves out teams that, had an ascendancy is the right word, I guess, in 1 year, or leaves out teams that perpetually almost made it, but didn't. I'm not sure I can name the rights. For a long time, I followed the Cleveland Indians, and they almost never made it after the olden days of Bob Feller and that group. And there's the Cubs, obviously, has always been considered a perennial loser, except for the most recent time in which they went the distance. But so the dynasty, what is a dynasty? A dynasty means succession. It means not just one, but more than one, many. And what you're saying, I guess, Ted, and let me let you say it, is there you can define dynasty any way you want, but at the end of the day, what you tried to do in this book and what you're talking about is you figured out particular traits that allowed or that propelled a team to be a dynasty. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, there were many common elements to the dynasties. And that really is the theme of the book. And the thing I started to notice over my 30 years of studying these teams is you saw the same things over and over again. You saw the obvious things of great pitching, great hitting, great defense. You generally saw great leadership, not only on the field, but in the front office. But you also saw little things that you wouldn't anticipate, such as certain players under the radar, played under the radar. They were not stars. They were never all-stars, certainly weren't Hall of Famers, but there were certain players that would rise up in key moments, in key games, and make key plays. And each team had at least one of those players. There was also a very interesting similarity in that all of the dynasty teams went through a major crisis at some point before they became a dynasty. And the example I'm going to give you right now is the example of the Cincinnati Reds in the 1970s. They were in 1975 and 1976, probably one of the best dynasties of all time. They were elite. But when in the early 70s, they had made it to the World Series twice in 1970 and 1972, but lost both times. And there was just something missing. And I learned about a story at the end of a game in 1973, which I think had something to do with this. The Reds played the Mets in the National League Championship Series in October of 1973. And during that series, and Pete Rose is a central figure in this story. During that series, there was a battle in the press over whether the Reds were chokers or not, and whether Rose was a choker. And this was made it into the New York papers, and of course the Reds players saw it and decided to do something about it. So in game 3 of that 5-game series, Pete Rose has an opportunity at second base to take out Bud Harrelson of the Mets, and he did so, sliding into second. And that led to a major brouhaha on the field. They were rolling around on the field. The fans really went crazy about that. And when Rose went out to left field in the next inning, he was just peppered with all sorts of objects: a whiskey bottle, beer cans, nuts and bolts, and batteries. And one wonders why the fans brought all that stuff to the game to begin with. But it was so bad that they had to take the Reds off the field, and they did so. And the Mets had to go out and take some of their leaders out to quiet the fans. And so that game was finished. The Mets won. And the next game, in Game 4, Pete Rose hit the game-winning home run in the 12th inning and ran around the bases with his fist held high. And of course, all that stuff just came flying back at him, and the crowd became more unruly. And the series went to Game 5, which was the final game in the series in New York. And toward the end of the game, it was pretty clear that the Mets were going to win. They were ahead 7-2 in the 9th inning. And there was so much concern about the crowd that the Reds team decided to escort their wives and families who were sitting behind the dugout down onto the field, out through the dugout in the clubhouse, rather than allowing them to go back out through the stadium where they would be in harm's way. And even in doing that, they were jostled, and a couple of the wives had their hair pulled and so forth. It was really becoming a very ugly scene. So then with 2 outs in the 9th, and there's a video of this that's narrated by Lindsey Nelson. That is pretty remarkable. And the Reds grounded out, and the fans just en masse came onto the field. And this video shows just thousands of fans. They think about a third of the fans at the game came onto the field. Well, in that last at bat, Pete Rose was at first base, and he had to run to second. And so he was out in the middle of that chaos when those fans came on the field. And Johnny Bench yells, "Everybody grab a bat." And that's what the Reds did. The Reds players grabbed bats and went out there to try and bring their teammates back safely. And there's anecdotal evidence of Bench hitting a young man on his shins with the bat. I'm sure that didn't feel very good. Ultimately, the Reds were able to get the players off the field. They went out to their bus, and the fans were out there. The fans had figured out which bus was the Reds bus, and they started to almost tip it over. It was rather rocking it back and forth. And then there was a Mets fan that brought a bugle to the game and was playing taps outside the bus for about an hour. And so this was a very traumatic experience. And imagine being on that field as a Cincinnati Red as that crowd came on, and it truly was chaos. But I believe that event and surviving that event as a team united those players. They had some issues before that point in time. Not all the players on that team got along, but what it did is it unified the team. And the parallel to business is that we will go through crises in business. We will go through pandemics. We will go through hurricanes. We'll go through fires. We'll go through all kinds of things. And there's opportunity in those crises for teams to improve. And what I encourage leaders to do is recognize that when it happens. And it's not all a woe is us or woe is me situation. There's opportunities for that team to become better if they get through that crisis together. So the Reds and Mets game is a good illustration of that.
My guest today is Ted Meyer, who is actually a real lawyer, and sometimes he plays a baseball aficionado. I'm joking about that. Ted is a full-time labor lawyer with the national law firm of Blank Rome, but he has written a book which will be coming out sometime in January of 2022. And the book talks a lot about baseball, but it also has the crossover illustrations, which Ted just went through one example of how crises and crises management, I guess is probably the better terminology, shows the mettle, so to speak, of the organization. And those organizations, be they baseball or be they Fortune 500 companies, how they adjust and handle that, and how they handle the morale of the employees is what determines their ultimate success. And that's one of the things that you wanted to bring out in your book. I'll give you a chance to comment, but I have sort of a follow-up question if you.
Go ahead.
Well, my follow-up question is again about baseball and the notion of what makes certain teams stand out more than others. So I remember back in 2002, 2003, 2004, there seemed to be sort of a collective view, not shared by everybody, collective. A lot of people said, well, you know, baseball's not competitive anymore because there's too much money and there's a disproportionate share of that money in the hands of a very few teams, notably the New York Yankees. George Steinbrenner, gazillions of dollars, could buy any player he wanted. And that was, you know, what determined whether you had a good team or a bad team. If you were a team in a smaller market with a smaller television or radio footprint, you didn't have a lot of money to play for marquee stars. And then a book came out, Moneyball, which was later made into a movie, which I don't know if it was its mission, but it attempted to try to disprove that theory and to say, no, there's other things besides money. So my question to you is, does your thesis in the book about what it is in terms of management that makes the difference, is that not in some way challenging the notion that it's all about money?
Yeah, money obviously helps, and it puts those teams like the Yankees and the Dodgers and the Red Sox in the mix every year, but it's not necessarily going to put them over the top. The Dodgers went a very long time, I believe since 1988, since they had won a World Series prior to last year. The Yankees have gone a little, for them, a long stretch without winning World Series titles. So while it can make you very competitive, the money doesn't necessarily put you in the dynasty category, certainly, or even get you necessarily to the World Series. Moneyball was very interesting. And what Moneyball did, it did challenge the notion that money is everything by sort of redefining the metrics that teams looked at to determine which players would be the best players for a winning team. And Moneyball questioned and sort of reestablished some metrics, for example, on-base percentage and way more complex statistics on how players could be evaluated. It wasn't just about how they looked, how big they were, how far they could hit the ball, the eye test, which was a big part of the recruiting of players in the old days. It really focused in on what they had done in the past statistically, how often they got on base, which was a big deal that Moneyball sort of opened up, is that it wasn't just about batting average, it was about getting on base and on base percentage. And so what Moneyball teaches us is we don't always use the right metrics in our organizations on how to evaluate our players or our employees. And we have to look hard at what sort of behaviors we want to drive with our workers and employees and leaders, and sort of reestablish metrics to gauge that and to motivate people to engage in the right behavior. It may not be all about sales. It may not be all about just cutting costs. There may be more sophisticated, more targeted metrics that allows an organization to succeed. And I think we can learn a great deal about that from Moneyball.
Well, I think in your book, which again, I haven't read it because it's not there yet. It's not out in publication, but I think that you focus on character issues for certain key individuals, and you have a lot of them. I know you mentioned one player, Bobby Brown, if I have that right,
Right.
Joe Torre, and others. Why don't you talk about some of the seminal moments or important moments for those players and how you feel that plays into this issue of establishing the character metrics that are helpful to maintain dynasties?
Yes, I'll start with the Joe Torre example because that's a terrific one. Most of us are familiar with the last Yankee dynasty which took place from 1996 through 2000. They won the World Series in 4 of 5 years, which was just an extraordinary accomplishment, particularly now in the age of free agency and multiple levels of playoffs and so forth. They were managed by Joe Torre. Joe Torre was a very good, if not maybe great, baseball player in his own right. And at the end of his career as a player, he managed the Mets, he managed the Cardinals and Braves.
Yes.
And he was unfortunately fired at each juncture, as many managers are. At some point, they're going to get fired. And so after his third firing, he had the dubious distinction of having the most games combined played and managed for someone that had not ever been in the World Series, and that bothered him a great deal. So that takes us to December of 1995, and it was at that point that his wife, Allie, came to him and said, "Joe, there's something about you I don't know. There's something about you that you seem to be hiding from me that you don't want to talk about. It's causing a disconnect in our marriage." And what she did is she encouraged Joe Torre to go with her to a marriage seminar at a hotel in I believe in Atlanta. And they went to that seminar. And at one point they were encouraged to stand up and talk about their past, something in their past that they had never discussed. And Joe Torre did that in front of this group of people that he had never met. He stood up and told a story about how his father had abused his mother as he grew up. And his father was a very intimidating man. He was a police detective in the New York Police Department. And he had a gun and he was a large man, and Joe and his brothers couldn't do anything about it. And so Joe Torre never learned to confront things. There's in at least a couple of books, there are stories of Joe riding his bike home as a 9-year-old and seeing his father's vehicle in the driveway, and he kept going. He wouldn't go in. And so Joe and his wife discussed this. It sort of got out into the open, and it made a difference for Joe Torre. The next year, he was hired by the Yankees, and they made it to the World Series. This was the team of Derek Jeter and Mariano Rivera and other great players. But the new Joe Torre sort of was revealed in the World Series itself. The Yankees were playing the Atlanta Braves. The first 2 games were in New York. The Yankees lost game 1, and at the end of game 1, owner George Steinbrenner came into Joe Torre's office and said, "Hey, this next one's a must-win game." And anybody that knows George Steinbrenner knows that he can be imposing and intimidating. And Joe Torre didn't even look up from his desk and said, "George, you should be ready to lose the next game as well. But then we'll go back to my hometown of Atlanta, and ultimately we'll win this World Series in 6 games, meaning we'll win the next 4. Which was a pretty remarkable, calm way to deal with being intimidated. But even more so to the point in game 3, and the Yankees did lose game 2. They were shut out by Greg Maddux 4-0 in New York. And so back in Atlanta, they play and the Yankees go ahead 2-0. And in the 6th inning, though, the Yankees pitcher David Cone got in trouble. He loaded the bases. Fred McGriff was up for the Atlanta Braves. And it was one of those moments in these playoff games where the tide was turning. The fans could sense it, and they were on their feet. And Joe Torre went out to the mound to confront David Cone. And there's a great photograph of this, which really tells the story better than I could ever tell it. But it reveals Joe Torre coming up, standing right in the face of David Cone and saying, "This is very important. I need the truth from you. How do you feel?" And Cone kind of said, "Well, I think I can probably get this guy out. I can, use the slider and so forth." And the picture shows catcher Joe Girardi standing there kind of looking away as if he just couldn't believe how direct the discussion was. Well, that wasn't good enough for Joe Torre. Joe Torre got even closer to David Cone, within inches of his face. And again, in short declarative sentences, very calmly, with this crowd just going crazy and the umpire trying to get the players to go back to the game, he said, "This is very important. How do you feel? I need the truth from you." And Cone ultimately got out of the inning. The Yankees got through the series and they won in 6 games, as Joe Torre had said. Cone later said that he could not believe the eye contact. That's his takeaway, is how direct and calm Joe Torre was in that moment. And one wonders if Joe Torre ever could have done that had he not gone through what he went through in December. And it just goes to show that leaders need to confront their own demons before they can really reach their peak as a leader. And I believe that there are many of us and many leaders who have things like this, that if they were to address them, if they were to be honest with themselves and do what it takes to get through these things, they could do better as a leader. And by doing this, Joe Torre completely transformed himself as a leader at age 55. As a leader at age 55.
So my guest, again, for those just tuning in, is Ted Meyer. He is an accomplished labor and employment lawyer with the national law firm of Blank Rome, and he has written a book, another passion of his. He said a hobby, and I said thankfully he didn't take up the flute during COVID. And he's drawing connections between successful baseball organizations who were able to establish a dynasty and how that success can come into play in the corporate world. I told Ted before we got on the air that there may not be time to talk about it, but I'd like to figure out some of the parallels from baseball into the political world, where we're seeing a fair amount of erosion of trust and competence. Because what I took away from your story just now about Torre was not just, as you said, that he confronted his demons, but he was able, as you tell it, to combine his intensity and his need to get his pitcher's head correct without shaming the pitcher. And he was able to come in and not say, for example, what the heck's going on out here? You're doing a horrible job. If you don't come back for the next pitch, you're out of here. Which is presumably what some managers might, some less successful managers, but to use a way of being clear, deliberate, no funny business, and at the same time getting the player to be more courageous in tackling the problem of getting the next batter out. I don't know. Do you agree with my synopsis?
No, I totally agree. We have breakdowns in communication all the time, in business, in the world of politics, et cetera, where oftentimes an intended message doesn't come across because the communicator really doesn't think through how they're going to communicate it. They need to consider how it's being received. They need to make sure that the person is listening, or that the group is listening to what they're saying. And you see this in tough conversations in the workplace. We have to have tough conversations with our employees. And in the world of politics, leaders have to have tough conversations with their constituency. And they really have to think through the phraseology of the really tough messages. And I like what Torre does. He slows down. He has a tempo that is very credible. He's very authentic. And that's another key here, is for leaders to be authentic and not try and be somebody else. And I think that's another thing that some of our leaders on the political stage and in business do, is they have learned to act like someone else. And that always fails, especially in tough moments, in crisis. Authenticity is everything. Many of you know the name of Casey Stengel. And Casey Stengel was, to some, the best manager of all time. He managed the New York Yankees in the 1950s. And he was very unique. He was known for his Stengelese. For example, once he said, "There comes a time in every man's life," and I've had plenty of them. One of my favorites is he went out to talk to a pitcher on the mound, and he was going to take the pitcher out. And the pitcher said, "Well, I'm not tired." And Stengel said, "Well, I'm tired of you." He had this great sense of humor, which added so much to a very stressful sport and team. And you can go back and see World Series broadcast footage from 1952. It's still available, and it's the Dodgers and the Yankees, and the Brooklyn Dodgers are actually ahead 3-2 in the World Series, with the last 2 games in Brooklyn. And you would think that Brooklyn would have the advantage and that they would be ready to go. And what the broadcast shows is 2 very different teams. It shows the Dodgers with great talent, but they were tight, and you could see it with their body language and everything. And the Mets were loose, and they were down, playing 2 games. They had to win 2 games on the road to win the World Series. And they show Stengel just kind of waving his arms around and kind of just very relaxed, and the team is relaxed. And the team took on the personality of their manager, I believe. And ultimately they accomplished what they set out to do. They won the World Series. But it was that authenticity, Casey Stengel being himself, and using humor appropriately in tough moments to succeed.
Well, I think what you just said is actually a really important point that I'd like to reemphasize, which is the team taking on the character of the manager. And I think, and then you mirror that with, or marry that to the authenticity issue. I think that is, from my experience, having worked in several different venues as a lawyer, that, the successful organizations don't have a leader who is always browbeating people, but they also don't have a leader who's simply saying, good job, and not really being authentic, to use your phrase. And again, I go back to the political sphere, and I think, as I think many times about what's happening with COVID and what's happening with, challenges to the Constitution. And I go back to FDR, somewhat hokey phrase, which if you had to analyze it, you'd say, no, I don't really believe that. But when he said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, whether you believed it intellectually or not, the fact of the matter is he seemed to believe it, but more importantly, he wanted everybody else to believe it. So that, again, back to your thesis in the book, I think, and to the thematic aspects of your book is, if you convey that you say, and you say that with conviction, not to put yourself on the pedestal, but to get other people to sort of go along and take the oar, to use another sport, then that's when success happens. And I guess you probably.
Well, and your example of FDR is a great one, because he understood the hearts and minds of the American people as well as any president. And he took us through 2 great crises with that largely on the radio, of people listening to him in his fireside chats, and they could hear that in his voice. And he understood them, I think, as well as any president ever. And we were very fortunate to have him at the helm during that time in our history.
Yeah, and again, not to continue too much further down on that note, I mean, Winston Churchill had the same thing, and there are things he said that we remember to this day, 70, 80 years, gone by, when he said, we're not at the end, we're not at the beginning, but at least we're at the beginning of the end. That was, well put, authentic, correct. And it demonstrated that that's where he thought the nation was. And of course, without Britain being tenacious, and obviously without the US participating, that war would never have been won. And I don't know, again, from your experience in advising clients, getting back over to the law, and where have you seen that? Have you talked about it? Does it come up in your counseling or in your presentations to businesses?
Well, I'll say on your Churchill example, I've been in the offices of many CEOs, and the one thing that I see in those offices more than anything else is some form of the Winston Churchill quote along the lines of "Don't ever, ever, ever give up." And I think that kind of phrase has just survived time, and is something that almost every executive seems to have in their office, and that they follow. So there's just so many things about the dynasties that resonate. I want to talk about diversity and inclusion because I think it's such an important part of our culture right now, and we all we're doing a better job of this in business. It's very important. There's a number of examples in the book on why it's important and what it's about, and of course, baseball. As we know, the major leagues systematically discriminated against men of color for 70 years until integration with Jackie Robinson. And baseball all of a sudden became better. The Yankees of the early 1960s ran into the Dodgers and the Cardinals and other teams who hired Black players at a much higher pace and were more diverse, and they became better teams. And in my book, I talk about the concept of group think. And group think is what happens when you have everybody in a room that's alike and they have a problem and they all decide to do the same thing. There's no debate, there's no discussion, there's no disagreement. And that is something that diversity brings. It gives different perspectives. And if we allow it to happen, if we allow diverse people to be involved in decision-making, better solutions emerge to the forefront. And whether it's whatever sort of business challenge it is, whatever sort of challenge we have in our nation, diversity drives better decision making. And I think one of the keys for executives going forward is to be able to not just say that diversity and inclusion is good, but be able to explain why it's good. And that's what I tend to do in my book as I go through a discussion of the Negro Leagues and then what happened to baseball after integration and how it improved. And personally, I grew up in the Midwest in a lily white town in the 1960s. And my view of race was formed by watching men of color and different men playing baseball together and winning. And it formed, I believe, a very pure view of race and fairness in race. And I think baseball has so many lessons that it can teach all of us. And the whole idea of diversity and inclusion is one of them.
Well, I want to explore that for a second. And again, I don't know if you went into this in the book, but most of what I've heard about the lockout, so to speak, of Black Americans, African Americans into baseball and other sports sounds in sort of pure racism. But by that I mean white supremacy. But it strikes me that the resistance to having blacks, let's just use baseball, which is the thesis here, of coming into the league was fear that some players legitimately felt that inclusion of Black players would make their job harder because some of those players were absolutely stellar. And it seems, again, not to sound this note again, it seems like that tends to fuel a lot of discrimination. The fear that, too much immigration, these people will come in and take over our jobs, so on and so forth. But it was particularly, I would guess, a factor in terms of the lockstep exclusion of Blacks for many years into baseball. Is that a true fact?
Yeah,
as far as you can tell?
There were many factors that went into it. It was at its core racism, and there were many players that were not in favor of integration. Some of them because they just knew that they would probably lose their job because there would be a better player that would come in. There were many factors that went into it. A lot of it was at the very top of baseball. Other sports actually integrated before baseball did. Football integrated well in advance of baseball. And it was just really unfortunate. And it was so unfortunate for not just the fact that these great players didn't get a chance in the major leagues, but the fans did not get a chance to see competition at the highest level. When you watched the World Series in the 1930s, you knew that you weren't seeing the best because there were players that were excluded. And it wasn't until really well after integration, probably into the 1960s, until baseball truly opened its doors to men of color. It took a while. It didn't happen overnight, unfortunately. And some teams did it better than others. Some teams saw the opportunity, were more open. You could see it, you could look at team rosters from the 1940s and 50s, and you could see the teams that made that choice earlier, and they succeeded. And it brought so much to the game. It brought more fans to the game. At the end of the day, it was good for baseball, of course. The fears, the racist fears at the time that, well, our fans won't like the product, or the fans that we have won't come to the stadium, were unfounded. Ultimately, and you look at baseball today, it's healthier than it ever was, with television money and integration and openness and the many Latin players that are in the game. It's just and Asian players. It's opened up to an entire new audience, and it's been great for the game. So obviously the exclusionary practices of the old days were just flat out wrong.
Well, I think another thing that you're bringing to light here in terms of competition is, it's a capitalist notion. Although today you sometimes seem to hear people who regard themselves as quote pure capitalists, not wanting competition, not wanting, and then that translates into not wanting competition, not wanting diversity, and not being willing to allow, folks to come in who bring something extra to the game in this case.
Well, and that was something that dates back to the even the 1920s and earlier. There were managers and leaders in baseball who wanted to sign Black players, but couldn't, just because of the way the system was at the time, and nobody really knows where that decision was made. But John McGraw, for example, is viewed by some, along with Stengel, as being one of the best managers of all time. He managed the New York Giants in the early 20th century into the early 30s, I believe. And when he passed away, his wife found among his effects a list of the Black players that he wanted to hire for his team. And so there were many factions, even back into the 20s and earlier, who very much wanted to integrate. Obviously, the Black press had a great deal to do with that, but there were white players. They actually took a poll among players in the 30s or early 40s about what they thought about the integration of baseball, and I believe it was something like 2/3 said it would be okay, that they would think it would help the game. So, it wasn't as though everyone involved was a racist. There were many people who were more progressive at the time who wanted integration earlier, but they just couldn't get the powers that be to agree with them.
So let me ask you again, sort of crossing back, I'm going back and forth between baseball and your other passion, your other hobby, your paid hobby, practicing law. Have you seen in your career a change in the mentality of business leaders about increasing, improving, being more understanding about diversity, be it race, be it women in the workforce, be it gays in the workforce, and so on and so forth, and seeing that there's been, hopefully in many quarters, an erosion of some of the innate prejudices, and that out of that something good has happened, not just to those individuals, but to those companies?
Yes. My firm, for example, Blank Rome, is very progressive on all fronts in diversity and inclusion, and has won some awards and so forth. And our clients want us. Our clients are driving us to do this. Our clients ask us when they send work, well, what's the makeup of the legal team going to be? How many women do you have? How many people of color do you have? And that is driving the economics of many decisions by clients on which law firms they they hire. And this has led to good things. Again, it's led to better representation. It's led to law firms doing better at diversity. Although I think law firms, in general, and there's different views on this. I think at least in the last 10 or 15 years, law firms have actually done pretty well in this. We have a long way to go, obviously, but we've made a lot of progress. So yes, and I think as leaders emerge, and you have kind of less old world views among leaders, you just see less of the bad in our leadership ranks.
Well, again, I'm going to pose another issue for you, which is to say, relevant to what you just talked about, is I think I've lived through a period of time in which adding women to the workforce, adding African Americans and Blacks and minorities was viewed by, I don't know, maybe perhaps both sides as sort of tokenism. We got to do it because it looks good. But then I think over time, and I think to today, it has nothing to do with how it looks. The fact is you have people who are talented, and by bringing diverse people into the workforce, it improves everybody. It's not just, oh, if I don't have so many Blacks, in positions in the law firm, I won't get Black clients or progressive clients. It's that it actually is an improvement. Is that how you call it?
Absolutely, no question about it. And not just that diversity is made part of the workforce, but they are promoted and put in positions of authority and are part of decisions. And this gets back to my point about avoiding groupthink and coming up with better solutions to problems we've had for a long time. A diverse decision-making group, I believe, will just about every time come up with a better solution than will a group of people who are all alike.
Okay. So, not just to have two lawyers talking to one another, I want to give you an opportunity in the time we have left to add a couple of other anecdotal stories about pure baseball, emblematic moments, emblematic, teams, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. One of the big problems in our workforce today are bullies. And oftentimes these people are very talented. They are rainmakers. They are top salespeople. They are people that tend to make themselves seem indispensable. They are oftentimes dysfunctional in the workplace. They will do favors for people, but then take advantage of those favors. And the great example in baseball of this is the story of Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth obviously was a great talent. He came into the league as a pitcher with the Boston Red Sox in the 1910s, discovered that he was even a better hitter than pitcher, and was ultimately sold to the New York Yankees, and had tremendous years in the early 20s. But he reported to camp in 1925 weighing 256 pounds, which is 35 pounds over his playing weight. He was carousing, he was drinking, he was not making curfew, and it had been a problem the entire year. I think this was a year when the Yankees did not do well. They were 7th in the American League, and Ruth's numbers were way down. I believe it was probably, in terms of the long seasons or the full season, it was probably the worst year of his career. On August 31st, 1925, in a game in St. Louis where the Yankees were there to play the Browns, Babe Ruth arrived late into the clubhouse. And the manager, Miller Huggins, was there, and he said, "Ruth, don't bother to get dressed." And he confronted Ruth, and he said, "You're suspended, and you're fined $5,000, which was an astronomical sum at the time. Huggins was, in physical stature, was a small man. He was somewhere around 5'4" or 5'5", and Ruth, of course, was huge. And Ruth tried to intimidate him physically, and then Ruth said, "Well, we'll see what the owner has to say about that." And the GM, and the owner was a great baseball leader by the name of Jacob Rupert, and the general manager was Ed Barrow, another great baseball person. And so Ruth did that. He went to the press. He said something like, "Well, the owner will never allow this to stand. That team needs me too much for me to be suspended. And the owner, Jacob Rupert, immediately went to the press and said, I am in full support of my manager, Miller Huggins, and Babe Ruth will remain suspended as long as Miller Huggins wants him to be suspended. And so what you have here and is an alignment of leadership, which was critical in that situation with a very with a misbehaving employee. And Babe Ruth never bothered Miller Huggins again. He got a personal trainer, got himself in shape, and what this resulted in was probably the best 6-year streak of hitting in the history of baseball. Ruth averaged 50 home runs, 155 RBIs, and hit 347, and that has not been done by anyone or anything close to that since that time. But it shows what leadership being aligned with individuals like this can do, because there's examples that go the other way where the individual was allowed to go have back chats with one of the leadership team and was able to kind of make inroads into taking away the authority of the manager who made the decision to suspend him. And it's just critical. And I go into this in pretty good detail in the book about how to handle employees like this, because it truly is one of the biggest problems in corporate America today. It's the misbehavior, bullying, behavior by the very talented among us. And we've got to control those situations.
So you can't let the player take over the franchise is what that story and others like it illustrate. Before, again, we started, you mentioned a little bit about Mickey Mantle, who I don't know, he also had his problems, although obviously a stellar player. You want to talk about that shortly?
Mickey Mantle was a great player. There's no question about it. And even today, in the age of sabermetrics, which have been retrofitted to the old teams, he looks even better because of his on-base percentage and other statistics like WAR, wins against replacement, and all these statistics that are discussed now. He looks even better. He had at the time, probably when he came into the league, was probably the fastest player in the American League. Probably had the most power. He seemed to be a combination of greats of the past all in one body. Of course, he was injured in many ways over the course of his career, and that really limited what he was able to do. But he was also an alcoholic, and he engaged in alcoholic behaviors with his team. The Yankees, as they got into the early 1960s, had been very good for a period of 40 years. There was a period from 1923 through 1962 where the Yankees won 20 titles in 40 years. But the Yankees began to deteriorate as baseball moved into the 1960s for a number of reasons. But one of them was the failure to really manage Mickey Mantle. And the leadership at the time was not like the Yankee leadership of Rupert and Barrow and Huggins. The team had been sold. Yogi Berra was actually the manager in 1964, and Berra was Mantle's friend, but Mantle would kind of make fun of Berra behind his back with teammates, and the young players idolized Mantle. I mean, there's a story of Mantle coming to the game under the influence of the prior night, and he's put into the game, and he goes out in the first inning and hits a home run. And runs to first base, and then just keeps drifting out into right field. He didn't, he needed help at that point to get back, and he was taken out of the game. But the point is that young players grew up idolizing that kind of behavior,
and that ultimately had a negative impact on the team. We are running out of time, and I'm sorry, that was really interesting. But I want my guest Ted Meyer to come back again. Ted Meyer is a labor lawyer with the law firm of Blank Rome, and also the writer of a book which will soon be coming out. Name of the book one more time.
The name of the book is Championing the Cause of Leadership, a look at the baseball dynasties, and the publisher is Business Expert Press, and it should come out in January.
Thanks very much for being on the show today, Ted. We'll have you back.
A pleasure. Thank you, Mark.
Sure.